I feel kind of bad. This is your volunteer over here has stepped up and is playing beautifully, and this is supposed to be my job, and I can't even keep it together to follow the order of service. So thank you for your generosity, folks. If you would now rise and join me in body or spirit in singing number 34, Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire. Well, good morning. It is so wonderful to be here with all of you this morning. I want to thank Reverend Jen for lending me her pulpit today. It's a different pulpit for me. Most Sundays, I am in the pulpit at the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Brighton. And it's not a terribly different congregation than this in some ways. And relative size and location, it's similar, the exurbs of a Rust Belt city. But there's one way in which this congregation and my congregation differ terribly, and it is in age. This year, my congregation will be celebrating 20 whole years since their founding. So my congregation was chartered when I was in high school. And I think this congregation was chartered when Queen Anne was in high school. Is that about right? So there's something that they're still grappling with, my congregation. They're still trying to figure out the same things that we all grapple with when we first arrive in the world. What am I doing here? Who am I? What is my purpose? And one of the first things that happens when a person or an organization arrives in the world and wants to know their purpose, one of the easiest answers to the question, who are you, is to give that person or organization a name. So 20 years ago, my congregation was having this intense debate about what they were going to call themselves. And there was one camp who said, well, why not just make it simple? We're the Unitarian Universalist Church of Brighton, Michigan. And then there was another camp that said, church? I didn't come to a church. I mean, I show up on Sunday morning to sing hymns in the sanctuary and listen to a sermon by the minister, but this is not a church. And so they did what most good UUs do. They compromised and called themselves the Community Unitarian Universalists in Brighton, or as my friend and mentor, the Reverend Dr. Michael Tino, calls them, our Holy Mother of not answering the question. And because they didn't answer the question, today persists this deep sort of conflict, this rift in the congregation that we did not settle on answering the question, are we a church? And you wouldn't think it would matter so much, right? But then what do you tell the people who come in for the new member classes? That seems to be the place where this battle is still brewing 20 years later in my congregation. I gave my first new member UU history lecture, and there was some people there that said, nope, you said our church. We cannot say that to new people. And then there was somebody else there who spoke up and said, you know what, I'm a lifelong Unitarian Universalist. I've always gone to a church. If you can't tell me that this can be my church, I need to go somewhere else. And then there was another woman who said, well, I'm Jewish, and I need a place to go in Livingston County where there are no synagogues, where I can be held fully for all that I am. And if you're going to tell me that this place has to be my church, then it's not here. And I thought, good, well, this is going to be easy to solve. And I thought about, what is the essence? What is it that we ask, who am I? What comes up? And for me, this image of the welcoming table kept coming up over and over and over again. The welcoming table, how do we set out a table that welcomes all people? And then I thought about food in general. Food, and how the food and the table that a place sets out says so very much about the makeup of that place. I was suddenly transported to church picnics at my mother-in-law's church that she grew up in southern Indiana, the First General Baptist Church of Co. That was a place that did not question what their purpose was or why they were there. And that as consistent as their theology and message was, so were their potlucks. My goodness, I've been to 3 church potlucks now, been married 3 years. Been to 3 different church potlucks at my husband's family's church. And there are 3 things that you can consistently count on being at these potlucks. There's always going to be pie for dessert. There's always going to be salad, which I've come to understand means Jell-O, with some kind of fruit in it. And there's always going to be fried chicken. Fried chicken, fried chicken, fried chicken. As far as the eye can see, more fried chicken than a group of this size could possibly eat themselves. Tables upon tables upon tables full of fried chicken. Every time, pie, salad, and fried chicken, you know what's coming. You're going to eat it, and you're going to like it, and you're going to go home full. And then I thought about our potlucks, about Unitarian Universalist potlucks, and how they were a little different, wouldn't you say? Unitarian Universalist potlucks, we have green things in our salads, usually, and green things in our salads, and also homegrown tomatoes from our gardens. There's always going to be a vegan and a gluten-free option, and in fact, we're going to label all of the ingredients in all of our dishes because we want to be cognizant of people's different dietary needs. And then, it seems like there's almost a rule that we have to have 2 different kinds of couscous dishes. I don't know why. It usually comes up. So I was thinking about the difference between those 2 kind of potlucks, and I was thinking how the kind of food that those 2 places served, it sort of went right in line with the theology of the places, right? I mean, so on one hand, you have the First General Baptist Church. You know what you're going to get. You're going to get the same thing every time, and if that food works for you, it is going to be wholesome, and you are going to go home satisfied and fulfilled. There is also an argument to be made that eating nothing but chicken and Jell-O and pie is somehow unhealthy, but if it works for you, you know it's going to work for you consistently, and if it doesn't work for you, you're simply not asked to participate. Whereas our tables, we seem to go out of our way to make sure that there's an option that can feed every person. In fact, we seem to make sure that everybody knows exactly what that they're eating, that they're consenting to what that they are consuming amongst us. And we care whether or not you're fed, although we don't seem to be overly concerned with consistency of message or dining option. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds like Sunday morning in both of those places. That definitely sounds like Sunday morning in both of those places. And I'm talking about this. I'm talking about laying out the welcome table. We're singing the song in service. And I have the same woman come to me and say, that's great, but as long as you say the word church, as long as you say that word, I am going to be left out as a Jewish person. And I thought, oh, she does not know the history of Unitarians, Universalists, but particularly Unitarians and the Jewish people. There is an argument to be made that the very founding of the theology of Unitarianism was based in including the Jewish people. See, right after Jesus died, there was about 300 years where the church wasn't really a homogeneous thing. People were sort of gathering in groups. There were people that followed the word of Jesus, sure, but what Jesus really said was that you should gather everybody together and take care of them and love your neighbor. I'm sure you've heard that one before. So there were Jews and pagans and a Zoroastrian or two thrown in, and they were all hanging out together, basically following the word of Jesus, which is that we should feed and heal all of the people, and that we should particularly gather to us the marginalized, that we should stand for those who are oppressed and vulnerable. And this was a great way to make congregations and communities of people grow, because it wanted everyone to be there and valued each person for who they were. But if your highest power is love, justice, and inclusion, it's not a really great way to be obedient to empire. So Emperor Constantine, about this time, was starting to have a real problem with these Christians because they were running around in the name of love and justice and defying every imperial dictate that he gave out that was the least a bit oppressive. No gladiatorial rings, no non-Roman slaves. It was a real cramp in his style. So he said, if you can't beat them, join them. And he declared that the Roman Empire was going to become Christian so that he could give the rules, so that he could be this higher moral authority. But first, you kind of had to decide what Christianity was, right? All of these loose communities believing whatever they wanted about Jesus, that wasn't going to work. So we started having all of these church councils where people would get together and the best minds of the day would argue their theology. Ostensibly, there would be a vote, but Constantine would pretty much pick. And then we would have doctrine. And then we would have dogma. And then we would have an official ruling of the church. It went really well, don't you think? And so, at the time, concerning who Jesus was, there were two basic voices, two basic schools of thought. There were two basic voices on the fringes. There were a lot of people in between. But one school of thought was this guy Athanasius, who said, Jesus is the Son of God. He is living God on earth. He is the same substance as God. You've heard this one, right? And then there was this guy named Arius, and he said Jesus was a prophet. He was a brilliant being, divine in his connection to that which is greater than all of us, a true vessel of the message of love and justice. He's just a guy. We should venerate his words and his memory, but he's just a guy. He's divine in the way that we all are. So Constantine heard the councils, and he was going to decide which one. He heard the words of Athanasius, and then he heard the words of Arius, and he thought, wait a minute. Just a guy can be venerated this much? If a prophet can be, what about an emperor? Maybe I can lift myself up so that there are communities of people gathering in my name to worship me. So he picked Arius' side, and everyone was a Unitarian. It was amazing for a couple of months. And then he realized that there were still some people who Jesus wasn't the center of their faith. They were still waiting for their Messiah. They were the Jewish people who worshiped Yahweh. And he said, all right, they're not going to listen to me no matter what. So you and me, Arius, we're going to persecute the Jews. And Arius said, wait a minute. We just came from that. We've just been being persecuted for our stance that everyone should be included and that we're going to take care of everyone. We're not about to start persecuting more people just because it's not us now. And Constantine said, oh, this is going to be a problem. So he went and visited Athanasius, and he said, hey, how do you feel about persecuting the Jews? And Athanasius is like, great, I'm all for it. So he said, all right, you're my new guy. Arius, you're out. And Arius paid for that bravery with his life, as he was pretty sure he knew that he would. But he went on to found a theological tradition that is today called Unitarianism, meaning that there is one God, no Trinity, that has consistently throughout the ages said that we will be a place, we will set out the welcome table for all of those who are persecuted and in need, because as you know, we are just terribly traditional people when it comes to church. And I say this, and we might be thinking, well, this is just a wonderful thing we did for them back in the day. But the thing is that every time Unitarian Universalists have opened our arms and our hearts to those who are in need, we have been made better for it. The Reverend Misha Sanders writes a wonderful paper about people coming out of internment camps during World War II, Japanese people, and not having any place to go to worship. And so Unitarian churches, particularly on the West Coast, opened their doors to them and said, you can worship in our sanctuary. And they looked at the pews and said, okay, and went to the social hall and moved everything aside and started doing these stretches and poses and meditating on the floor. And pretty soon, there wasn't a church on the West Coast that didn't have some sort of Buddhist meditation or yoga practice. The same thing almost happened with paganism. In the 70s and the 80s, there was still a swath of people that were getting their children taken away from them from practicing the occult. Witchcraft back in those days meant witchcraft. It wasn't folks getting around to celebrate the solstice. But there was a woman named Margot Adler who was a Unitarian pagan witch. And she told her community, I have a safe place for you. I know where you can worship that you won't be persecuted. And she started having solstice celebrations in the churches. And pretty soon, these radical women, they started looking at our hymn books and they're like, everything in here is very male-oriented. And they talked to the UU Women's Federation about it, and the UU Women's Federation said, yeah, I know, we're just kind of used to it. And they said, ought you be? And that's how our new hymnal got created. Our new hymnal with more inclusive, new, it's from the 90s, but it's much more inclusive in words. And today we still have the covenant of Unitarian Universalist pagans that worships among us. And who here hasn't been to a brilliant and beautiful solstice or equinox celebration? It's not on a national scale, but in my home congregation, in the Unitarian Universalist Church of Detroit, right after 9/11, the Islamic Center of Detroit, which is the mosque located across the street from my church, somebody threw a Molotov cocktail in the window. The mosque got set on fire, and it was going to take months for them to renovate. It also happened to be a time when we were searching for a new minister. And we invited our Muslim neighbors to share worship with us. And once a month, their imam would come and talk about things that were important and spiritual and universally true and lovely. It helped our worship budget, and they had a place to go. And even in a time when the very concept of church was being shaken in the wake of the scientific revolution, where people were saying, you know what, I don't think I need a place to worship, I need a place to reason. We said, we invite humanists here to worship with us, because to worship is just to give worth to. It's just to give worth to. We don't need a strict definition of a sentient God. You can have that, but it's not necessary to be among us. Remember, our higher powers are love and justice, and as long as you adhere to those, we don't care what form they take for you. We care, but they're not the most important things. And today, when every other Protestant faith is leaking members, Unitarian Universalism is holding strong because in an era when people can't get down with the idea that there is a sentient power that cares about the score of the football game on Sunday ruling everything, we say that's not what we're founded on. Every single time we have opened our doors to someone else's ideas, we have been made better for it. In fact, during the civil rights movement, when there were all kinds of radical ideas being floated, it was really difficult for Unitarians and Universalists at the time, for some of them, to get around this idea that we weren't a justice organization, we were a church. We should stay out of all of those rallies and calls by MLK. But the people that went the most, the people that showed up, the Unitarians and the Universalists, they got to know each other really well. And they realized that they shared faith. They shared faith in a common future. They shared faith in the power of love and justice. And in a time when Unitarian and Universalism started to dwindle in numbers, they decided that by getting to know their neighbors, and they could decide this because they got to know their neighbors, that they were going to come together and form one religion, which was going to grow and become strong. Think about our table. Think about how much more enriching it would be if we allowed people to, alongside our couscous salad and gluten-free brownies, add latkes at Hanukkah and dates at Eid. And so I think about the table, I think about the potluck, and I think, if I go to a potluck, I think it's good if I like about 80% of what's on the table. I'm probably not going to be able to fit everything on my plate. I don't need to try everything there, but there needs to be a core thing, a core group of foods that I can eat that are satisfying and nourishing to me. I think the same thing about Sunday morning. If you like about 80% of what's coming out of the pulpit on Sunday morning, you should be good. 80% is a pretty high percentage. Most Christian people that go and listen to the doctrines of the church, and Islamic people that go and listen to the doctrines of the church, and Buddhist people that go and listen to the scriptures and the teachings, they only believe about 80% of that stuff, if they're lucky. So we have a wide variety of wisdom and ideas available to us. But what I can't understand is sometimes something will be said, something that will challenge someone on the justice front, or something that will be too theological or not theological enough. It'll be said, and people start to get really upset about it. I have people come to me all the time and tell me things I said or things that I didn't say. And I think, how's the other 80% of the things going? Because honestly, maybe you don't want a vegan gluten-free brownie. But maybe that's the only way someone else there is going to achieve sweetness. So this is my plea to you as open-minded and open-hearted people. Set out a welcome table. Set out a welcome table with each service that you do. You know what I finally decided to say to people in the new member classes about whether or not it was a church? I said this: Unitarian Universalism is a long and proud religion which has a heritage of love and justice reaching back to the very first days of what we know as the Christian church. Does it have to be your church? Absolutely not. You can't tell somebody else it's not theirs. Folks, there are two ways to set out a meal. You can make a table, you can set it out, you can put all your favorite things on it, and you can tell people that they can eat if they want. Or you can invite people into the kitchen and create meals together. May we, as a people of welcome, ever strive to do things the second way. Blessed be and amen.